To sew a cylinder, I have 2 circles of the same size cut. I'll measure around the circle to find how long I need to make the cylinder. I'm starting at this crease here as a marking point so I know where to stop. And then I shift the tape measure around the circle, lining it up around the edge. And careful to shift the tape measure instead of pulling the fabric of the circle. On the areas where the fabric is cut along the bias of the fabric, it can stretch easily, so I don't want to pull the circle flat. Instead, I pinch the circle and the tape measure and shift it around. And I started at 1 inch instead of 0, so I need to make sure to account for that. This gives me a more accurate reading and measurement because the end of my tape measure has a metal tab and is not always super precise. So I like to start at the 1 inch mark. So I'm back to the place where I started, and I'm at 16 and 5/8 of an inch. So I'll cut a rectangle that's 16 and 5/8 of an inch plus half an inch. 15 and 5/8 of an inch plus half an inch for seam allowance. And then I'll make it the depth that I want for my cylinder. I cut a cylinder or a rectangle to make my cylinder, and this is 16 and an eighth of an inch. I had 15 and 5/8 of an inch, and then I needed to add half an inch for seam allowance. So that is what I came up with. So what I'm going to do now is fold this in half with right sides together. I need to sew a couple inches on the bottom of this joint and a couple inches on the top. I need to keep an opening here so I can right side out this once I sew the cylinder. So I sewed the top and the bottom. You can see there's a gap that's about 2 inches, maybe just a little bit less, just enough so that I can right side out this when I finish sewing it. And now I'll open this up and I'm going to pin the circles into this, and those will get sewn on both sides. So I'm making sure all of the seams are on, that will be on the inside. So I just place this here, and what I'm going to do is first I want to iron these creases out because it's hard once it's in a cylinder form. But I fold this in half here, and I'm really just going to mark the half spots, and then I fold the half spots together, and I'll mark the quarter spots here. And then I'll do the same thing on my cylinder. So first, the easy half would be this seam here, and then right here. And I want to make sure that my markings are on the inside of my fabric. So I like to just pinch it a little bit because it doesn't really crease it like ironing would do. It'll come out, but it marks it long enough that I can see that crease, make a mark. And this just gives me a guide of how to line up my cylinder. So I have my pin cushion, And I'm lining up the cylinder. Or the circle to the cylinder shapes. So I just pin those straight down into the fabric. And I'm just making sure all the points that I've lined up are meeting. So I drew that point on the circle and then also onto the cylinder or the ring shape. Line those up and pin it. And I'll go around and get those first 4 pinned together. So I have that spot with this spot. There we go. I have all of these pinned together, and I'm just going to add a couple more pins. So you can see I want to ease this in to that cylinder or to the ring shape. So I can just hold this where it should go. And first I'll pin the center. I really want to make sure that curve of the circle lines up with that edge there. It's really easy sometimes to let that curved edge pop up over that line. So I'm doing 3 pins in between each of the quarter segments. So I'll end up having 16 pins total. So I have this first circle pinned onto the top of the ring or the cylinder, and I'll go ahead and sew that whole thing on, and then I will flip it around and sew the other one onto here, and then I'll right side out it through this hole and hand stitch this back up. I like to start right where the seam of my piece is, and I'm sewing 1/4 inch all the way around. Before I start sewing, I put my needle into the fabric and remove that first pin. So I have to really position the fabric and start, some of the fabric wants to start coming out as I'm sewing, and I need to make sure that it stays together. And I remove the pins as I'm sewing. And I want to make sure the back fabric is not puckering. So it starts puckering as I start curving around. And I'm just doing 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. And I'm making sure that the needles don't go into, so the pins are not punctured with the needle, so I don't break a pin. a little bit slow because I'm trying to make sure that I sew the circle all the way around. So now what I can do is double check to make sure all of those seams have been sewn and there aren't any puckers in that fabric. So I'll go ahead and pin the other circle to the top of this, sew it together, and then I'll take it through this hole here of the cylinder and I'll right side out it. I've sewn both sides of the circles onto the cylinder. And now I just open up the hole that I left into the center of the cylinder of the sewing the sides of the fabric ring together. And this is really thin fabric, so it's not going to hold the form unless I stuff it. So what I can do is stuff it, but then this edge here that was left open, now it just gets folded in and then hand stitched up with a blind stitch. So I want to make sure to get all of those edges out. I could even clip into the seam a little bit before I flip it out inside out, but this one seems to be holding up just fine. So there's a cylinder, and obviously the longer you want the cylinder, the wider this piece of fabric needs to be